The stories. Why locals avoided that church basement after the flood. The church sat on a low rise beyond the river curve, and everyone still called it a safe hill. Neighbors said the floodwater reached the stained steps anyway, and the basement stayed damp long after the river fell. Clara Vass, 34, worked as a field insurance adjuster who took pictures, typed notes, and kept calm voices moving. She drove into the town after the levee break, aiming to document damage and close claims before tempers soured. Her goal for that day was simple: confirm a cluster of small claims tied to the hilltop church. The first change to her plan arrived when the custodian waved from the door, then refused the handshake. He gave his name as Ortis Malo, 57, a retired welder who mowed the lawn and watched the boiler. He said the sanctuary was fine, then pointed at the basement with a look people wear when a dog growls under a porch. Clara asked for access, and he said the pastor wanted meetings upstairs only. She took exterior photos, careful with angles, noting water lines marked by silt and by seeds caught on mortar. A neighbor named Nella Groft, 61, carried a crate of hymnals toward a sedan and paused to watch her. Nella said the basement had stayed locked since the flood week and that no one wanted to carry anything down there. Clara liked facts more than rumors, so she asked for invoices, damage logs, and utility records. Ortis handed over a folder with photocopied bills, each page smelling like bleach even through the plastic sleeve. The electric bill showed a high spike the week after the river fell, which struck her as odd for an empty space. When she asked for the basement key, Ortis rubbed his jaw and said the lock stuck, then said the pastor handled everything personally. She kept her voice soft, mentioned schedule pressure, then offered to meet the pastor after dinner and finish this site today. He agreed, but he kept glancing at the stairwell door like it might open on its own. Clara went to the county office and checked archived calls for emergency service, using an index the clerk let her see without fuss. The church address appeared twice during the flood days, once for a fuel smell, once for a welfare check that cleared in minutes. A dispatcher note said volunteers had stacked food in the basement for short-term storage. She returned before sunset, met the pastor near the front pews, and introduced herself with her license card. Pastor Enoch Varela, 46, wore a work shirt with rolled sleeves, and his palms looked scraped at the knuckles. He repeated that the sanctuary took no damage, then said the basement had a minor issue they were addressing privately. Clara explained her process, said transparency helped claims move faster, and asked for a basic walkthrough with photos. He agreed to a limited tour, then warned her that the air down there felt close and would not be pleasant. She took out a disposable respirator she kept for mold sites, and he nodded with relief, like that solved part of it. The key turned after a stubborn rattle, and the door opened with a smell like wet paper mixed with diesel. Steps went down into dimness that felt cooler than upstairs, and the walls showed a faint brown tide mark. Her light found a row of folding tables stacked with canned goods and boxes, all tied off with twine. Several tabletops were warped, and the legs stood at different heights because someone had shimmed them with hymnals wrapped in plastic. A generator sat to one side with a coiled cord, and the floor around it showed a clean square like a rug had been there. She photographed outlets, tagged the generator model, and asked why they needed so much power for a basement pantry. The pastor said the generator ran sump pumps for 2 nights, then stopped working from grit in the line. Ortis stood near the bottom step and rubbed the rail, his knuckles pale, like he hated the room and also belonged to it. Clara noticed a water line over the breaker box, which meant the panel had taken a hit and still looked strangely spotless. A woman appeared in the doorway, waved, and introduced herself as Paloma Cray, 32, a volunteer nurse with the food team. Paloma asked if Clara needed masking tape for labels, then added that people had slept here during the flood watch. The pastor cut in with a quick no, and Paloma closed her mouth and drifted back into shadow. Clara felt the hush that follows a correction and decided to run her questions in a sequence that built without heat. She asked about occupancy during the flood, and Pastor Varela said only supplies had been staged downstairs. She asked to see any damage to pew cushions or classrooms, and he steered her back toward the stairs with a brisk thank you. In the parking lot, a teenager skated past and kicked the curb, then said people said the basement hummed after midnight. He pointed at the brickwork view vents near the ground and said sound came out like a freezer that could talk. He grinned, then looked sorry for talking, and pushed off toward the next slot without another word. Clara sat in her car and recorded a memo into her phone, keeping the tone neutral and the timestamp obvious. She reviewed photos, zoomed on the clean square by the generator, and marked a note about missing equipment. That square looked like freezer footprint, and on a raised plan like this basement, a freezer could stay mostly dry. Her next stop was a building supply yard, where she asked the clerk for recent sales of heavy appliances paid in cash. The clerk shrugged, then said a man from the church bought a chest freezer late in the flood week and paid without a receipt. That detail qualified as a witness statement, and she typed it as such, careful not to lean on it more than it deserved. Evening pushed in, and she returned for one more look while people set up for a community meal upstairs. She asked Paloma for 5 minutes in the basement to recheck the panel labels, promising to stay out of the way. Paloma agreed, then quietly handed over a small key that looked too new for an old door, her eyes level and steady. Downstairs, the lights flickered as if a loose connection lived somewhere behind the fresh panel cover. Near the far wall, she found 2 pallets draped with tarps that had been taped several times, and the tape pulled white in places. A faint, sweet odor rode the damp smell, like fruit left in a trunk after a warm day at the lake. She lifted a corner and found case water stacked over a long trough cut into the slab, its edges chipped and sharp. A length of garden hose ran from the trough to a sill drain where floodwater had once receded, and the hose still glistened. She followed the hose with her light, stepped around the tarps, and saw the end shoved behind a dented freezer. The cord was gone, but a film of oil on the floor traced a path toward the clean square near the generator. She crouched, counted to 5 to settle her breath, then stood and walked back toward the stairs to reset her approach. On the way up, she passed Ortis as he came down, his arms full of clean towels for reasons that felt unclear. Clara asked if they had documented any salvage from the basement that could justify the electric spike. He nodded too quickly, said there had been a spill from a donated machine, and that they had cleaned it thoroughly after. She thanked him, then stepped outside and listened to a rain gutter tick as the day cooled into night. Her hotel room was quiet, and she laid the photos on the table beside the binder she kept for flood jobs. She cross-checked the electric spike days against the generator ownership dates, using calls the county clerk let her copy. A pattern formed, modest and plain, which said power ran in the basement several nights after the river pulled back. She called a friend who worked restoration and asked about standard practice for wet freezers in basements. He said most techs would drag them outside, prop the lid, and tape a sign to keep people away until haul out. He said running a generator indoors for a freezer was dangerous, and added that diesel odor with sweet tang usually meant refrigerant leaked. Clara returned at first light and found Paloma sorting donated jackets on the front steps. Paloma watched the street, then said she had worked disaster shelters before and knew that water brings out the best and worst. She said she had asked to close the basement, and that she would be happier if an outsider made decisions for them. With Paloma present, Clara requested a formal walkthrough with full photo documentation, and the pastor agreed after a long pause. He suggested they invite a town officer to keep things calm, and she agreed without hesitation since an extra witness helps. Officer Renwall, 39, arrived and signed the site log that Clara carried in her bag for exactly this moment. They opened the basement door together, and the smell rose again, edged with sourness that set teeth on edge. Wren kept a straightforward tone, said they would check for safety risks and nothing more, and the pastor nodded with his jaw set. They moved toward the far pallets, and Paloma touched Clara's elbow, then pointed with 2 fingers at the sill drain. Clara photographed the hose, the trough, and the freezer compression dents that matched a recent move across gritty floor. Wren looked at the panel and said the cover was new, then asked if an electrician had cleared it, keeping his voice even. Ortis said he would get the paperwork tomorrow, and stared at the drain like he feared what might back up through it. The twist waited in a storage closet behind a rolling chalkboard where someone had stacked plastic tubs in a neat column. Wren asked permission, lifted the lid on the top tub, and found medical waste bags tied with careful knots. The labels showed a clinic in a nearby county, and date codes matched the flood week plus 3 days after. Paloma exhaled, then said the town clinic had shut power during the worst night and that someone offered temporary cold storage here. The pastor stared at the bags and rubbed his temple, then said yes, they had tried to help and keep things under control. Ordis said the freezer had failed, they had panicked, and they had moved what they could to ice chests upstairs. Clara kept her voice in the middle as she asked whether any records accompanied the delivery of those bags. The pastor produced a photocopy from his wallet that showed a shaky agreement to secure and return the materials promptly. Wren read it twice, nodded, and said they needed to report this and arrange a proper collection, and the pastor said he understood. The pieces now fit the noise locals heard at night, the generator, and the spike in the bill after the rain. Refrigeration had kept those bags stable for a short window, then failed when the sump pumps stole too much current. The sweet tang in the air had been refrigerant, and the last trace of spoiled ice from makeshift coolers. They documented the closet, sealed the tubs again, and carried them upstairs where the air felt simple and bright. Wren radioed the county, asked for a hazmat team and the clinic contact, and kept his words plain so no one panicked. Paloma called volunteers to move the meal upstairs, and they did it quietly, like they were shifting a sleeping child. Within an hour, a small truck arrived with 2 techs who spoke carefully and signed every line Clara handed over. They packed the tubs into rigid containers and handed the pastor a receipt that settled chain of custody without drama. The tech said this sort of mix-up happens in storms when freezers are scarce, and that it becomes a cautionary tale for years. After the truck left, Clara took final photos of the basement and noted the cracked trough that had worried her from the start. She recommended a full inspection for the panel and air testing before volunteers returned to work downstairs. The pastor agreed, his voice steady now, and Ordis finally sat on the steps and let his shoulders drop like a load had slid off. The town never made a scandal of it, since nothing criminal had been intended, and the fix was clean and quick. That said, people still avoided the basement for a while, since memory can stick to concrete and walls like damp. They spoke of the humming nights as a warning, and they stored donations upstairs where anyone could see them in daylight. Clara filed the report that afternoon and drove out past fields that glittered with wet leaves pushed against fences. She felt no thrill, only quiet relief that the pieces had held together and that nothing worse had formed in secret. Her notes added a simple line that generosity without planning can rot faster than anyone expects in warm water. Later, she learned the church held a small meeting and told their members the whole sequence with plain language. They apologized to the clinic and offered money for the generator fuel that had been wasted in the failed plan. People appreciated honesty, but the basement kept its reputation because reputations have long legs when the air has smelled wrong. By autumn, the concrete was scrubbed, fans had run for weeks, and the panel wore a new sticker from an electrician. Still, a few congregants preferred folding tables upstairs, and no one minded because sunlight makes simple promises. When it rained again, the pastor stacked extra caution tape by the stairwell and kept the door locked without debate. Neighbors now say they avoided that basement not because of ghosts or whispers, but because they knew the facts. They remembered that freezers hum for reasons, and that a locked room with a sweet tang is a message rather than a mystery. The town chose to listen, and the story settled where most real stories live, halfway between relief and regret. Clara closed the file and moved on to other roofs and other high-water marks, keeping her methods the same. She asked ordinary questions in steady sequence and waded through pauses that often carried more truth than quick words. The church needed time, the town needed air, and the basement needed light, and they all eventually got what they required. Years later, the flood was referenced as a hard season, not a nightmare, and the hill stayed a safe hill again. People mentioned the humming when they taught young volunteers how to store donations and why clear logs matter most. The pastor still kept the key, but he also kept the receipt that proved the chain unbroken, which made him sleep better. Clara would sometimes pass through on other assignments and find Paloma sorting jackets on the steps with calm hands. They would wave as if nothing remarkable had happened, which felt correct because the point was that nothing worse had arrived. The basement door stayed closed unless the work demanded it, and that quiet was the final lesson worth holding. The snowplow incident on Dalton Highway. In early winter of 2019, a road crew based near Coldfoot reported a missing operator after an overnight maintenance run north. Drivers said the weather thinned for an hour near Otagon Pass, then returned with sharp spindrift across the grade. The report reached a small dispatch room where radio traffic had stayed busy with chain controls and stalled rigs. The first message named a man who left mile marker notes, then failed to clear his scheduled checkpoint on the north slope. The operator was Mark Reyes, 44, a contract plow driver from Fairbanks assigned to the Slope District for the season. He ran a late shift that began after dusk with fuel topped and a spare V-belt strapped under the seat. His purpose was straightforward since the company had a fixed route that required timed passes across exposed sections. Witnesses remembered his voice on the radio sounding even, with short replies that kept to mile numbers and cold readings. Dispatch logs from that night list a start north of Coldfoot at 1900 hours, with guidance to hold before Atagun if winds rose. Archived notes in the district binder describe patch ice near the summit and reports of light snow sliding off the cut banks. A tanker convoy reportedly waited near Dietrich River since heavy gusts had pushed 2 tractor-trailers into the berm earlier. The shift sheet shows Dana Willis, 39, a dispatcher based in Fairbanks who stayed on the channel while supervisors rotated. State records show Reyes had 12 winters on heavy equipment, with no citations and a completed safety course during 2011. He'd worked pipeline access roads, he'd pulled a grader for a private quarry, and he'd logged clear plow counts on previous runs. His intent that night was to punch through 3 choke points, then meet a mechanic near Galbraith Lake for a salt spreader swap. The mechanic was Evan Tuttle, 52, a seasonal hire whose task was to transfer gear and check hydraulic temperatures before midnight. Some locals claimed a whiteout dropped into the pass fast enough to erase taillights and mute engine sound, yet truckers never agreed. One driver said strobing snow gave the illusion of hills moving sideways across the road while the wheels stayed straight. Another said the wind was loud, but gaps kept opening, and distant beacons appeared steady along the grade for several minutes. Investigators never confirmed a single window of clear weather, since recordings captured only static bursts and clipped phrases around the summit. At 2100, Reyes checked in at a pullout south of the pass, with coolant temperature stable and front blade pressure within range. He mentioned one brief shudder through the chassis that felt like a rut, then silence followed until a short click cut the frequency. Willis radioed back twice with location requests and received nothing, then pinged a nearby rig to scan the shoulder with high beams. The rig driver said he saw drifting grooves that could have been old tracks since fresh snow filled them within seconds. A tracker unit on the plow reportedly sent 3 location bursts clustered near a curve marked by a steep drop to the creek. Technicians said the pings bounced off a repeater and came through delayed, so the timing stamps failed to match the voice log. Search teams moved in after midnight from both sides, and a grader led with chains laced tight across 2 tires. Snow fell in sheets that flattened depth and made shallow cuts look like pits, which slowed the lead truck to walking speed. They reached the curve at first light and found a blade mark that ended clean beside a low drift with no metal exposed. A second pass scraped the shoulder and revealed a hard ridge with chunks of ice wedged above a narrow gouge that fell away. Rope teams moved over the edge and found short slide debris on a bench, then a broken marker flag snagged against brush. No frame parts surfaced during those hours, and the creek ran under plates of ice that shifted with a faint grinding sound. County file from 2009 includes a similar incident where a grader vanished for 2 days before surfacing downstream near a bend. That case resolved when thaw lowered the berm and exposed a mirror that caught sun from a brief break in cloud. The comparison circulated among crew members who kept working the shoulder, yet the terrain here was different with steeper runoff cuts. Records conflict on how quickly the water can rise under drifted ice after strong wind, and the team deferred to the field lead. By late morning, a fuel tender from Deadhorse reached the site and set up heaters near a staging point above the drop. Tuttle arrived from the north with tools and asked for the last radio phrase, then checked the hydraulic lines of a parked plow. He noted a tendency for the quick couplers to chatter during crosswind, which could sound like harsh rattle over the cab floor. Mechanics later wrote that cab noise might mask a failing sensor, since cold snap could trigger alarms that barely breached the static. Aerial support from a contractor circled the pass after wind eased, and the observer described a faint brown scar cutting the slope. The scar blended with ripples left by earlier slides, and a few dark smudges along the line looked like willows pressed flat. Photographs show no bright paint or reflective decal, though one frame catches a straight groove pointing toward a tight creek bend. Investigators never confirmed those features as relevant, since snow squalls smeared edges between frames and made distances hard to judge. Afternoon brought a partial clearing that revealed a fan of ice shards downstream, and a thin sheen of coolant floated in a pool. Samples were jarred for testing, and the chain crew shifted downhill with bars to pry plates loose where the creek narrowed. A snapped radio whip surfaced near a root ball and looked fresh, but the base had no distinct paint and the mount was missing. Some locals claimed scavengers grabbed parts fast after wind events, although crews said nothing moves under that much drifted ice. Willis compiled a timeline that night using dispatch logs and audio clips, then flagged minutes where Reyes last sounded clear and calm. She included notes on tanker releases and 2 reports about a stopped reefer whose engine coughs overlapped the plow check-in. The final packet lists contacts with the state patrol and a maintenance foreman who drove south to relieve the tired search crew. That foreman added tire print photos that seem to double along the shoulder, which can occur when chains stamp over their own path. During the second day, a Parkerized tow hook appeared in a melt pocket with scratches no wider than a thumbnail along the curve. The hook matched a model used on the plow fleet, yet maintenance inventory showed 6 variations that had circulated for years. Without a serial, technicians wrote a reserved note that placed the hook in a probable category rather than as verified evidence. Some locals claimed the hook drifted from higher on the slope, while others said the creek likely dragged it after a brief surge. On the third day, crews uncovered a ladder rack buried in compact snow beside a narrow stand of willows near the creek. The rack fit, the plow make, and bolt patterns lined up within tolerances, which moved the case toward a likely location. A downstream net caught a small panel stamped with 2 digits that matched the fleet series, though corrosion blurred the final number. Investigators never confirmed whether the panel came from Reyes's machine, and state records marked the find as inconclusive with an asterisk. A trucker who runs that road each week provided a sworn statement that places a bright headlight west of the proper lane. He said the beam cut across a hump of snow and flashed once, then vanished as wind shifted, which he logged against his odometer. Another driver produced a dash recording where only hiss and faint pops can be heard during that minute near the summit pullout. Records conflict on whether either account fits the minute Reyes went quiet, since clock drift and reception gaps complicate the match. A fourth-day probe found the plow nose buried in a kink where the creek dives under a bank and resurfaces in a small pool. Divers worked under ice with lines and spotted a cab corner wedged against a boulder, then a shattered mirror floating free. The recovery took hours as the weather dropped again, and the team cut a trench to guide the frame toward a winch. When the cab cleared, the seatbelt latch showed marks from impact, and the ignition key sat half-turned with the radio switch on. The medical report is brief and cites blunt force trauma with a probable sequence that begins with a sudden drop along the hidden bank. It notes no sign of alcohol and a normal panel, plus bruising that aligns with a violent jolt as the frame struck rock. Investigators never confirmed whether the initial slide began from crosswind push or a shelf collapse that undercut the drift from below. The final line lists cause as accident during storm response, with contributing factors that include limited visibility and shifting ice. In the months after, crews added poles near the curve and new markers above the creek, and radio checks increased before the summit. The company revised night runs and paired plows for that section, while dispatch set tighter windows for convoys during early gust fronts. Some locals claimed the changes came too late and that old warnings about the creek shelf sat ignored in a forgotten drawer. Archived notes show earlier mentions of undercut edges that never reached policy, though supervisors say budget cycles delayed permanent fixes. The Dalton Highway kept running through that winter and the next, and the pass remained a place where visibility turns to noise. State records preserve the photographs and the hook, and the rack sits tagged in a bin that lists the mile number. Drivers still slow near the curve and watch the creek where drifted plates hold for a week, then crack without warning. The file closes with a sentence that keeps to the facts and a road sign that leans slightly north when the wind rises. The stories. What stayed behind in this motel room window? The room was standard. 2 beds, a humming wall unit, and a window that faced the parking lot where big rigs idled through the night. What didn't look standard, once the sun rose low and flat, was the faint writing that only appeared across the glass at a shallow angle backward, patchy, like a message scrubbed hard but not gone. Rhea Mallory, 37, an insurance field adjuster on a week of hail damage claims, noticed it as she packed. She had meant to drink the motel's thin coffee, make 2 calls, and hit the interstate before the heat came up. The plan wobbled when the gold light caught on the pane and stitched a sentence out of streaks. She leaned close. 3 words. Reversed. As if intended for someone outside. The first resolved quickest. He. The second took longer. Was. The third broke into stuttered islands before joining. Here. Rhea didn't trust hunches for work, but she did trust her eyes. The glass held something that wanted to stay. She touched the pane with her knuckle, careful not to smear. The letters were not marker or paint. They looked like oil lifts, the kind that come from fingers pressed to a clean surface, then wiped without full success. Years of photographing dent patterns and windshield webs had made her look for directionality, downstrokes, stopping points. The H's verticals were heavier at the top. Somebody had reached up to write it. The height matched a kid, maybe a small teenager, maybe someone standing on a heel. The backward presentation meant whoever wrote it had been inside the room, not out in the lot. Rhea stepped back, then forward again, catching the angle to reread. He was here. It wasn't much by itself. Still, it clicked against something she half remembered. A flyer she'd seen in a gas station along this same highway, western Nevada. A wide run of sage and salt flat about a kid who had vanished years ago, last seen near an old roadside motel. The details on the flyer had been faded and generalized, and she hated the feeling of turning strangers into puzzles. But the message on the glass wouldn't let go. She snapped a photo, then another with the curtain pulled halfway to throw side shadow. Insurance habit. She set her phone on the sill and made a line in her notebook. Room 23, North Building, roadside motel off the state route near the truck stop, morning light from the east. She added the date in her own style, early September of 2011, because she'd learned that memory softens the edges of time. Down at the front desk, a man with the posture of a coiled garden hose slid a receipt across the counter. He wore a shirt with a stitched name. Denton Kroll, property manager. He had the long stare of someone who had solved the same small problems for too many seasons. Rhea mentioned the window, casual like it was a maintenance note. Cleaning streaks, Kroll said. Windex when the sun hits. He tapped the desk with a capped pen. Happens. Could be, she said. It looks like words, though. Backward, like someone wrote from inside. People do all kinds of things to glass, he said, not looking up. Kids breathe and draw hearts. Guests leave handprints. Our crew wipes it down. Since when have you managed this place? Rhea asked. Still casual. Late 2000s, he said. Before that, it was old Mr. Levitt's. He let things slide. We've replaced a lot of panes, Truth told. He would not say more, and she didn't push. It wasn't her business. She was there for roof photos and the dent farm on a fleet of sedans. But curiosity has a way of hiring a seat beside duty. Back in the room, she stood the motel stationary on edge to catch more oblique light. The letters resolved again. She took a slow breath, then put her phone on voice memo not to narrate, just to capture the ambient hum and her measures. A trick a photographer had taught her to anchor memory later. The air smelled like old cleaner and the metal tang of the window track. Her internal clue came by accident. When she slid the curtain fully open, the bottom hem snagged on a plastic spacer in the aluminum frame. The spacer was cracked. held with a sliver of old tape. The tape wore a different sheen than the rest of the frame, brittle amber with torn fibers pressed into it. On top of that tape, ground into the glue, lay a tiny fleck of blue wax, the kind cheap crayons leave. Someone had taped something in place, maybe a page, maybe a label long enough for wax to settle. It matched the backward writing. If a sign had ever been stuck there, it would read correctly to the room. She wrapped the little tape shard in the motel stationery. Not as evidence she wasn't law enforcement, but because it felt wrong to leave it to a vacuum head. She took macro shots of the frame, the spacer, the wax fleck, and the area of glass where the words showed best. Then she checked out, turned in her key card, and drove to the first claim 2 towns over. She told herself it would end there. It didn't. At lunch in a diner with counter stools and a corkboard of lost puppies and church suppers, she asked the waitress if the motel had any stories. The waitress, thin braid, name tag reading, Paloma rolled her eyes. Depends on your appetite, Paloma said. Folks, stop, sleep, leave. Years back, a trooper sat there with coffee for a week straight. Didn't say why, just watched the door. Remember when? Rhea asked. Late 90s? Maybe early 2000s? Paloma said. Time fuzzes. He had a name like Otero, or something like that. People said a kid was missing. No one talked specifics. Rhea looked at her phone photos again in the car. He was here. She tried to leave it alone. That night, at another motel 2 counties away, she gave in and called the number on a public information page she found for the State Highway Patrol. A desk officer forwarded her to a sergeant who handled cold inquiries. She left a measured voicemail, using evidence terms that felt correct to her station. I'm calling about a motel window in Western Nevada. Room 23, North Building. There's old oil-lifted writing that reads he was here when viewed at an oblique angle. There's also tape residue with blue crayon wax embedded in a spacer on the frame. I'm not asserting anything, just saw it, photographed it, and thought it might matter if there were any archived calls tied to that property. A day later, a woman called back, voice steady, words spare. She introduced herself as Sergeant Mara Vickery. Rhea put her on speaker and laid out exactly what she'd seen in order. Vickery didn't indulge or discourage. She asked for the photos and the exact position of the room relative to the parking lot. She also asked about the condition of the glass scratches, chips, or a logo in the corner that would indicate the manufacturer and tempering date. Rhea checked. The corner carried a faint etched mark. She had to tilt it hard to read. She wrote it down. Vickery hummed. The way someone does when a thing aligns with a file in memory. Here's what we have, reportedly, Vickery said. In late spring of 1999, a teenage boy traveling with extended family was reported missing along that corridor. Last confirmed sighting was a convenience store, 2 exits from your motel. Dispatch logs note a search and a hotel canvas. Witness statements varied. No sign. The case is cold, not active. We do not discuss names. Her tone made a boundary plain without being harsh. I'm not asking for any names, Rhea said. I can send you everything. One more thing, there's a crack in the plastic spacer on the frame that's been taped over for a long time. The tape is ambered. There's blue crayon wax ground into it that felt like it was from inside, not outside. Copy that, Vickery said. Send what you have. Rhea sent the photos with a short note. She expected silence. Instead, Vickery called again the next afternoon. The mark you read on the glass etching is interesting, the sergeant said. It indicates the glass was manufactured in 2003. The motel you stayed in? Our old notes suggest it had original panes at the time of the search in 1999. So, if the panel in room 23 was replaced sometime after 2003, whatever writing you saw could predate that replacement only if transferred in some way. More likely, the writing was made after 2003, meaning the message came later than the disappearance, Rhea said. Most likely, Vickery said. This isn't a TV turn. It doesn't solve anything. But it revises assumptions about timeline and occupancy. It suggests someone connected, or someone who wanted us to think they were connected, came back to that room after 2003. We would need maintenance records to know exactly when the glass went in. It made sense. and it did not hand her any drama. It did offer direction. Rhea drove back after her last claim and asked for Kroll again. She didn't pretend she had authority. She did not hint at leverage. She simply showed the macro photo of the etching and the cracked spacer and asked if he had any records on window replacements. Kroll rubbed his jaw as if checking for new bones. "We replaced a batch after a wind event," he said. Glass was whistling. "I'll look." He returned with a gray file folder crusted with post-its. Inside sat stapled invoices with dates in the margins. Early August of 2007, Units 12 through 24, North Building. Supplier, Lima's Glass Service. Installer initials? "You mind if I photograph these?" Rhea asked. "Knock yourself out," Kroll said, and for the first time, he looked tired in a way that wasn't irritated, just human. The external confirmation came when Rhea called the number on one of the old invoices and got a man answering on the second ring. "Lima's," he said. "Hector speaking." He remembered the job, long run of aluminum frames that had gone chalky from sun, Hector Limas said. "We swapped panes and spacers where needed. I had to rig a few things because the sill channels were bent. We didn't touch curtains. New tempered glass, stamped 2003 because that's what the distributor had bulk." "Do you remember room 23? Rhea asked, knowing the question was broad and that memory is a wide net. "Vaguely," he said. "I remember one where the inside of the glass looked fingerprinted even after cleaning. We assumed someone had handled the pane before it cured. The housekeeper complained the smears came back in certain light. We used ammonia. It didn't fully lift. That's not unusual. Oils can ghost." "Did you ever see writing in the oil?" she asked. "Could've," he replied. "I don't read windows for stories. We replaced what was cracked. You're talking ghosts. They happen. If you think it's more, tell the troopers." She had already done that. She thanked him and wrote his comments down exactly, adding reportedly and remembered vaguely, because precision and humility can keep a story honest. Over the next week, Rhea kept doing her real job, hail dents, roof lines, signature blocks, while she let the window gather its own weight. The sergeant called one more time to say they had pulled the motel's old work orders. The pane in room 23 had been replaced in early August of 2007, matching the invoice. Maintenance logs around that month showed a housekeeping note. Writing keeps showing on 23 window. Tried vinegar. Still shows in morning. That note was funneled through a retired dispatcher named Sella Winters, who had saved a cardboard banker's box of old shift printouts, the way certain people keep the world from slipping because they know it tries. A quiet logic emerged. The boy missing from 1999, and there was never a name spoken, could not have written he was here on a piece of glass installed 8 years later, unless he returned. That didn't guarantee that he had. The message could have been a relational echo, a cousin, a friend, someone marking grief. But the tape shard and the wax fleck told another piece. The blue wax had come from a cheap crayon, likely pressed while paper was taped inside the frame. That suggested a small person sitting there, drawing, or someone steadied a page while trying to line up letters against the glass. The residue was on the inside spacer, not outside. That meant a moment happened in the room, not on the lot. Vickery asked a small favor that Rhea could do without crossing lines. Return to the room and try to lift a better photograph with crosslight. Rhea booked herself back into the motel on her own dime at the tail end of a loop. She requested 23 and got it after a shrug from Kroll. She came prepared with nothing fancy, just a black foam board to bounce light and a cheap angled flashlight from a hardware store. When the first edge of sun moved off the far hills, the letters bloomed again. She fixed the angle with books and the foam board, then took a series at different exposures. In 2 of them, a smudge sat low and right. Below the third word, barely a mark unless you expected it. It looked like a short curve with 2 dots and a drag. Rhea stared until she understood what shape it wanted to be. A crude smiley face, the kind drawn in 3 seconds by distracted hands. In the room notebook, decades old, Sella Winters had jotted a dispatch aside in 1999 that mentioned the kid's habit of drawing quick smiley faces in margins when nervous, according to a teacher's comment taken by phone. That was not proof. It was a soft echo between 2 separate things. Still, the echo categorized itself as relevant. When Rhea sent the new images, Vickery didn't tell her it solved anything. She said, this tightens the inference that whoever made the marks had knowledge of the kid's habits or was the kid. It also keeps the time frame post-2003. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. A pane installed in early August of 2007 kept showing lifted writing when morning light hit right. Housekeeping noticed. The content read, "He was here," and, in some readings, a simple face below. Tape residue and a crayon fleck lived on the interior spacer. Maintenance logs matched the install. A glazier remembered ghosted oils. Dispatch logs from 1999 contained an aside about a kid's doodles. None of that made a clean line to cause. It did what good detail does. It removed a few wrong lines. The twist, quiet but firm, landed 2 months later. Not for Rhea's benefit, and not with fanfare. Vickery called to let her know that, in reviewing archived calls surrounding the motel, a short anonymous tip from late summer of 2007 had been found. The caller, whose voice was masked by the crush of a payphone, had said only, "Check the north building, second floor, room by the ice machine. Mornings show messages." The number had been a dead end then. The note sat in the file without connection because no one had compared it to the install logs. Now they matched. The pane had just been replaced. The message, then, could not be a relic from before the disappearance. It was a marker laid down later, possibly by someone who had returned to a familiar place to say something without saying much at all. Rhea asked the only question she could. "Does this help?" "It helps me not waste time on a wrong year," Vickery said. "Sometimes that's the whole gain." And that was it. No chase, no doors kicked. Instead, a timeline corrected by what stayed behind in a motel room window. Rhea didn't tell the story to anyone who would make it into a campfire shock. She kept the tape shard in a small envelope with the word motel and the date in her hand, even though she knew it had no chain of custody value. It wasn't evidence for court, it was gravity for memory. On her last pass through that stretch of highway before winter, she pulled into the truck stop at dusk and watched the north building of the motel throw its square lights into the lot. The window of room 23 held the look of any other. A woman in a denim jacket let down the blinds. A kid ran past, dragging a suitcase that clicked over seams. None of them knew what the glass had whispered. That felt right. A real story refuses to belong to whoever tells it the loudest. Rhea stood there until the sodium lamps came up and turned everything the same, tired amber. The hum of diesel engines filled the air, the kind of sound that flattens thought. She thought, briefly, of the words someone had pressed there with damp fingers and of the faint, silly face below. Not testimony, not confession, just a note at the exact height of a small person trying to leave proof of a breath. The truth in it was not the grand kind. It was the modest, late kind, the kind that lets people who do this work say, later, with care, that a thing likely happened in a different month than everyone thought, and that a pane of glass, replaced in early August of 2007, had kept those mornings honest for years. She drove away without looking back, because looking back is for when there's nothing left to file. The motel settled into the dark, the window settled into shadow, and whatever stayed behind stayed there, just oil, just light, just enough. The stories. Paramedic who kept one final snapshot. The story began with a photo that shouldn't have existed. A single Polaroid, slightly overexposed, showing the inside of an ambulance during a call that supposedly never happened. It was discovered years later, tucked between the pages of an old medical manual in a small-town fire station's archive. The man behind that photo was Martin Kessler, a 42-year-old paramedic who'd spent nearly 2 decades working in a quiet coastal county. He was the kind of person people trusted instantly, steady hands, calm voice, always first on scene and last to leave. Colleagues said he never forgot a face, even from calls years earlier. That photographic memory made the irony of what happened next impossible to ignore. In late March of 2012, Martin and his partner, Dana Ruiz, responded to a dispatch from a stretch of highway north of town. A rollover accident, single vehicle, one driver, reportedly conscious but trapped. The log shows they arrived at 2:17 a.m. Weather clear, visibility decent. Everything about the report was ordinary until it wasn't. When firefighters reached the car, there was no one inside. Seatbelt unbuckled, airbags deployed, engine still ticking from heat, no footprints in the gravel shoulder, no sign of struggle. Dana's field notes mention Martin standing there longer than anyone, staring into the dark beyond the guardrail, as if waiting for something to move. He didn't say much on the drive back, just, "It doesn't feel right. Someone was here." The next morning, Martin called the dispatcher, asking for the driver's name. There wasn't one. The system had registered the call as civilian report unknown source. No 911 record existed, only a radio relay from a patrol unit that later denied making it. That was when Martin started keeping a notebook part medical log, part journal. He filled it with incident details that didn't make sense, addresses that didn't appear on maps, names that changed between shift reports, an emergency call from a decommissioned nursing home that had burned down 5 years earlier. Dana joked it was his ghost file, but Martin treated it like evidence. In mid-April, station archives show him requesting a portable camera from inventory, the kind still used for accident documentation. He said he wanted backups for reports. No one questioned it. That camera became the source of the one photo that remains. On May 5th, Martin responded alone to a cardiac distress call in a residential neighborhood. The official dispatch recorded a woman named Eleanor Marsh, age 71. When Dana arrived 15 minutes later, the house was empty. No patient, no signs of struggle, only Martin sitting on the front steps, shaking. He told her he'd just finished chest compressions, but there was no body. That evening, he turned in a sealed envelope to the station chief. Inside, a single Polaroid showing an elderly woman on a stretcher inside the ambulance. Her face pale but peaceful, IV line in her arm, heart monitor reading a steady rhythm. The timestamp on the photo matched the call, yet no hospital in the region logged a patient by that name, and the ambulance's GPS data placed it in the station lot at the time. For weeks, the department treated it as a data glitch, a wrong timestamp, maybe a mistaken upload. Martin, however, stopped taking calls entirely. He used his accumulated leave and disappeared from the rotation. Dana later said he'd started visiting the county records office, spending hours looking through missing persons reports from the 1990s onward. According to the clerk's statement, he requested files on one case repeatedly, a local woman, 71 years old, who'd vanished from her home in May of 1996. Her name, Eleanor Marsh. She'd been last seen the same week a younger Martin had begun his EMT training in that same county. What tied them together came from an old photograph Martin found in the file. It showed a group of EMT trainees standing beside a vintage ambulance. On the far left, a younger Martin smiling awkwardly. On the far right, a woman in a white nurse's uniform, Eleanor, back when she'd volunteered with the training program. Her sudden disappearance had never been solved. The case quietly closed after 3 years. The evidence stacking grew stranger. In late May, an internal audit found Martin had accessed archived radio frequencies from the old dispatch system equipment retired in 1999. He'd been trying to trace the source of that first mysterious accident call. Logs showed someone or something still transmitting on that outdated frequency once every few nights, always repeating the same brief phrase, "medic en route." By early June, Martin returned to work briefly, though he looked exhausted, his once steady hands trembling. He told Dana he thought the woman from the Polaroid had been trying to reach him for years, that all the phantom calls were echoes of old emergencies, looping through time until someone finally answered. She begged him to take time off again, but he refused. "If I stop listening," he said, "they'll stop trying to come home." The last confirmed sighting of Martin Kessler was on June 15th of that year. Surveillance footage from a rural gas station shows him fueling the ambulance alone, headlights off, before driving north toward the old highway. The timestamp reads 2:17 a.m., the exact minute of the original rollover call. 3 days later, the ambulance was found parked beside a defunct rest stop, keys still in the ignition. The driver's side door was open, the radio turned to static. In the back compartment, responders discovered a single Polaroid camera lying on the gurney. It contained one undeveloped sheet of film. That image was later processed by the state lab. It showed the inside of the ambulance, empty except for a stretcher, with two folded paramedic jackets placed neatly side by side. The back doors stood open, facing a foggy stretch of road. The official report labeled Martin Kessler missing, presumed deceased. No further transmissions were logged from the old frequency. The firehouse quietly retired his call sign, and the Polaroid was sealed in evidence storage, tagged simply, "Recovered from Unit 7, June 15, 2012. Years later, when new recruits asked about him, veterans would point to the framed photo on the wall, the one of Martin and Dana receiving their service award in 2010. Behind the glass, barely visible under the reflection of overhead lights, there's a faint double exposure. The outline of an ambulance interior, doors open, a stretcher waiting. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. The snapshot was real, the patient never existed, and somewhere along that forgotten highway, a paramedic might have finally answered a call meant only for him, the Bridge Creek drowning that wasn't recorded. Locals in Deschutes County still mention a cold evening on Bridge Creek when a man vanished without an official entry. Witnesses later argued over the hour and the light while the water ran clear and slow beneath alder shade. The only certainty, according to archived notes kept in Bend, was that the call for help never landed where it should. The gap in paperwork turned an ordinary search into a puzzle that keeps reappearing in winter conversations. The man most often named was Trent Avery, 42, contract carpenter, in the area to price repairs on a seasonal cabin. He reportedly arrived 2 days earlier and slept in his truck near Sisters to save money, according to a motel clerk. The cabin owner said he never signed in or asked for a key because daylight was already fading near the ridge. The owner told deputies he expected a text that never came, which is a detail that repeats across later statements. Avery met one person that afternoon, a fisheries tech named Mara Collins, 34, state employee, checking culvert screens along a Forest Service spur. She said the creek looked safe for a crossing at the ford, which remained shallow where gravel spread across 2 tire lanes. Her state records log for that date lists water clarity as good and current speed as moderate with no debris above the culvert. She remembered a white cooler in his truck bed and a neatly folded jacket on the passenger seat. Dispatch logs from that week show wildfire smoke along the highway and intermittent tower issues between Sisters and Camp Sherman. A technician wrote that calls sometimes hopped east before returning, which could explain later confusion over which county heard the first report. A private tower contractor filed a brief noting brief resets during the evening hour when shadows lengthened across the creek. The record is not a smoking gun, but it sits near the time window witnesses describe. Collins said she left him near 5 while the light still held and the ford looked routine for any cautious driver. She told investigators he waved and asked about the old bridge pilings that stick from the bank near the bend. She reportedly replied that the pilings belonged to a logging ramp that washed out when storms changed the channel 2 winters back. She did not recall him stepping into the water or walking the gravel bar to test the footing. State records list a cloud front moving in from the northwest with cooler air that sometimes makes breath show at dusk. A ranger out of Sisters wrote that the creek often looks tame until a beaver dam upstream lets a pulse slide through. That can raise water a few inches quickly, which becomes meaningful in a narrow crossing where tires already press wet stones. The ranger did not say this happened that night, only that such pulses occur without sound along that reach. The first missing person alert does not exist in the county file from 2009, though later forms reference an original call. One deputy said the form might have been faxed to a non-emergency line that stopped accepting overnight traffic. Another deputy thought a visitor probably dialed from near the highway and hit the wrong jurisdiction due to the tower skip. The absence of a timestamp feeds the theory that information arrived in pieces and never landed in a single folder. Two anglers claimed they saw a dome light blinking near the ford sometime after dark while the truck sat angled to the bank. They argued about whether the engine idled or whether they only heard water sliding against stones under the alders. Some locals claimed a third person approached the scene on a bicycle and left without speaking, though investigators never confirmed such a rider. Their statements match on the dome light detail and diverge on almost every other point. Avery's sister later provided archived notes from his phone bills that show attempts to call a Ben number around 8. The number belongs to the cabin owner who had already driven home to Redmond and silenced his ringer above the garage. Records conflict on whether a voicemail ever arrived because the carrier log shows activity while the device log shows only a missed call. The discrepancy is small yet meaningful when trying to place a voice in a narrow hour along the creek. Searchers walked both banks at first light and found boot tracks that entered from the gravel bar and faded where cobble turned firm. A tape measure and a photograph shows a stride that stays even then shortens near a shallow channel cut by the previous week rain. They recovered the white cooler 50 yards downstream, caught against willow roots, with the lid unlatched but nothing inside. The jacket remained on the passenger seat exactly as Collins described, which adds a quiet weight to her timeline. A retired deputy who reviews Coldfield files said the map grid for the initial sweep sits one square too far east. He blamed a habit of copying last season templates during busy weeks and missing small shifts in volunteer practice. That oversight pushes a key waypoint off the creek, which could explain why a thermal search missed a figure in the brush. He did not frame this as proof that someone waited there, only that the error changed where people looked first. In later interviews, a hardware clerk in Sisters remembered Avery buying a short toe strap and a shovel with a fiberglass handle. The clerk thought he mentioned a soft approach near a ford where ruts filled and needed a few minutes with a blade. The receipt time lines up with Collins and the ranger notes, which places him near the creek before dusk with reasonable tools. The purchase does not prove a crossing attempt, yet it keeps the possibility within a narrow band of motives. A volunteer firefighter described a call that almost arrived, a carrier ping that appears in a phone report but not in dispatch logs. He said the station door was open for inventory and the tone speakers clicked once without the usual follow message. He wrote his memory down years later for a training handout, which makes it more story than record. Still, several younger volunteers say they heard similar clicks during that month when the tower resets annoyed crews. Divers checked a pool downstream where the channel tightens and lifts small whirl lines against a rock rib under the bank. Visibility stayed poor due to fine silt stirred by a mid-morning wind and a brief flow rise from upstream wetlands. They found no clothing or wallet and no keys, which matches the detail that the truck cab stayed unlocked at the scene. The diver lead said the bottom felt mostly smooth with scattered roots that would have caught a heavy object easily. Weeks later, a property survey crew flagged a scrap of fabric trapped on barbed wire near a floodplain meadow. The piece looked like work pant material and carried fine silt that stains in the specific way Bridge Creek water does. A lab in Salem could not confirm much beyond weave and color range, which overlaps with common brands used by local contractors. The finding neither closes the case nor clears any doubts about the unrecorded call that started the confusion. Avery's truck eventually left the impound lot and returned to family after a modest court order that resolved a storage dispute. The odometer reading suggested little movement beyond the approach and the short angle found by deputies at first light. Tire pressure on the right front ran low enough to pull a light vehicle toward the wet edge during a cautious attempt. A mechanic said that detail matters only if a driver felt rushed and chose not to air up before crossing. Some residents claimed he might have walked out before midnight after losing patience with the patchy calls and weak signal near the ford. Others said a car picked him up on the highway and drove north toward Warm Springs, a route that thins quickly after dark. Investigators never confirmed either thread because camera coverage along that stretch remains limited and cash purchases leave quiet trails. The two stories survive because neither collides with the evidence found by the creek. Years after the search, a regional auditor reviewed communications procedures and noted that inter-county coordination improved during the next season. The report mentions additional training with tower vendors and a shared checklist when pings show cross-jurisdiction drift for emergency calls. None of that resolves where Avery went, yet it addresses the blank square where his first alert should have lived. The lesson sits quietly in meeting minutes while the creek keeps moving stones along the shallows. The file remains open in a narrow sense with periodic review when new hikers report odd finds in willow tangles after spring runoff. Most of those reports fade after a deputy drives out and looks where grass has already leaned and lifted again. The absence of a recovered body keeps speculation tethered to polite voices in diners near the highway and the mill. The story persists because the paperwork gap made a simple night on a small creek feel like an argument that never ends. The stories. This dispatcher flagged a warning nobody else heard. In the summer of 2015, a small county dispatch center in the Midwest logged what should have been another quiet night routine calls, minor accidents, nothing serious. But at 2:36 a.m., dispatcher Lorna Keats flagged a single line in the call log with a red warning tag. The rest of the shift didn't notice. 12 hours later, a missing person report came in from the same road. Lorna was 52, a mother of 3, and one of the few veteran dispatchers still working nights. She'd spent more than 20 years listening to the county breathe through static. Drunk drivers, runaway teens, distant gunshots that usually turned out to be fireworks. That night, she was scheduled to train a new hire, Evan Rhodes, a quiet 20-something fresh out of community college. He remembered her as calm, methodical someone who double-checked even the quiet calls. The call in question lasted just 19 seconds. It came from an unregistered prepaid cell phone traced to the stretch of County Route 47 between mile markers 19 and 20. The caller didn't say much, just a breathy male voice repeating, "He's still here," before the line cut. Background noise? Steady hum, maybe an engine, maybe wind? Lorna replayed the audio 3 times, then filed it under possible domestic disturbance. But something made her stop the recording and reopen it. According to her later statement, she heard a faint ticking sound under the voice mechanical, uneven. Like a turn signal that never clicked off, she said. At 2:38, she added a note, "Warning possible vehicle hazard, County 47. No one responded. The patrol car assigned to that region had already been rerouted to a stranded motorist 15 miles away. The shift ended at 6, and by the next day, the flag was buried beneath dozens of other overnight notes. 2 days later, a farmer found a truck half submerged in a drainage ditch along the same stretch of road. Inside was 30-year-old Bradley Norham, a construction worker from a nearby town. Engine still idling, phone missing, seatbelt unlatched. Coroner placed the time of death around 2:40 that same morning, within minutes of Lorna's flagged call. County investigators wrote it up as a single-vehicle accident. They said Bradley likely swerved to avoid a deer, hit the embankment, and drowned before he could escape. Lorna, however, couldn't let it go. She'd handled too many wrecks to ignore the timing. The ticking sound, the phrase, "he's still here," the untraceable number, it didn't add up. A week later, she retrieved the audio from archive storage and took it home on a thumb drive. Her husband found her replaying it that evening, headphones pressed tight, not speaking for almost an hour. She said she thought she heard 2 different voices, one layered under the main one. A whisper, or maybe a radio echo, she told him. He dismissed it as interference, but Lorna wasn't satisfied. She called the phone company listed in the report, Westridge Cellular, to ask about prepaid tower logs. The representative told her the call had pinged off a repeater near Old Mill Road, 2 miles east of the crash. Problem was, that tower had been offline for maintenance between midnight and 3 a.m. She double-checked through county records. The outage was confirmed. If that was true, the call shouldn't have connected at all. When she brought this to her supervisor, he told her it wasn't her concern. "The system hiccups sometimes," he said. "Let it go." Instead, she filed a quiet memo through the internal server detailing her findings and sent a copy to a friend in the State Highway Patrol. The friend, Officer Miriam Cole, kept the note, but admitted later she didn't think much of it until months afterward. Then, in November of that year, a storm knocked out power across the same district. During the outage, technicians discovered a repeater box still running from an auxiliary generator, a model decommissioned years earlier. Inside it was a burned SIM card fused into the port. Serial number partially visible. It matched the first digits of the untraceable phone from Lorna's warning. This detail never made the official report. A small internal inquiry followed, but concluded there was no functional link between the repeater malfunction and any known incident. By that point, Lorna had already transferred to a day shift. She told coworkers she didn't want to hear the night anymore. Years later, a regional journalist researching abandoned communication systems stumbled on the archived memo. The journalist, Alan Marin, interviewed Lorna at her kitchen table in 2020. By then, she'd retired and moved to a smaller town near the river. In the recording, which he later shared for a local podcast, she said something quietly that caught his attention. "You know what gets me?" he said. "He's still here." Not, "I'm still here." Someone else was supposed to hear it. Alan followed the breadcrumb trail dispatch logs, weather reports, the crash file, and that malfunctioning repeater. He found that the generator inside had been serviced twice after its supposed decommission date, each time by a subcontractor called Northspan Utilities. Northspan had folded in 2013, 2 years before the incident. Whoever maintained that repeater after the shutdown wasn't listed in county records. Alan managed to contact one former Northspan technician, a man named Dennis Harlow. Dennis said that in the early 2000s, some repeaters were used to piggyback maintenance frequencies for nearby rail lines. It was a cheap way to test emergency signals, he said. But it was never supposed to overlap with civilian channels. If it did, you'd get bleed-through, like ghost calls. Ghost calls. That term caught traction online when Alan's podcast aired, though Lorna hated it. She said the word ghost turned it into superstition, not signal bleed, not malfunction. Still, she admitted the possibility haunted her. The crash site, the voice, the timestamp, they lined up too neatly. In 2021, the county repaved Route 47, covering the drainage ditch. The wreckage was long removed, but for maintenance training, new dispatchers were still shown the red-flagged log from that night as a case study in procedural diligence. The warning nobody else heard became a quiet legend among the staff, half cautionary tale, half proof of how easily small details slip away. What remained were fragments. The 19-second clip archived under a generic file name, the memo Lorna wrote, the service invoices from Northspan, and the coroner's note listing water in the lungs. Each on its own could mean nothing. Together, they formed a pattern too odd to ignore but too thin to prove. Lorna passed away in 2023. At her retirement gathering the year before, a few old colleagues brought up the story. She just smiled and said, "It was probably static." Then, according to Evan, her trainee from that night, she added quietly, "But static comes from somewhere." At this point, the facts that remained were simple. One call, one warning, one man dead on a dark county road. The system logged everything perfectly except for the truth behind that 19-second window. Whether it was interference, a misrouted test frequency, or something else, no one could ever show exactly who made that call or why it stopped where it did. Still, in the dispatch training manual filed a few years later, there's a footnote beside Lorna's case study. It reads, "Always listen twice before you clear a line." No capital letters, no bold text, just quiet advice embedded between procedural codes. A reminder that sometimes the sound we dismiss as noise might be the only signal that matters. The woman who disappeared near Carver's Gap. Travelers who stopped at the high pullouts near Carver's Gap reported a woman who waved once, then walked into thin spruce. The trail ran along the bald, where wind hit with steady force from the Tennessee side. Lights stayed flat and cold despite late afternoon, and the ridgeline carried radio traffic from both counties. No one noted a plate because the parking area mixed hikers and locals without clear lines. The first call reached dispatch just before sunset, according to logs released later. Her name in the county file from 2009 matched a teacher who had moved between Carter and Avery over several years. She was 38 and worked part-time as a substitute while picking up seasonal museum hours in Johnson City. Friends said she came for the rhododendron bloom and stayed for the quiet above the state line. She reportedly carried a cheap handheld map and a stainless bottle marked with blue tape. Investigators never confirmed whether she owned a reliable compass, despite several receipts found in storage. The last certain sighting placed her near the wooden post where the Appalachian Trail heads north across the grass. A retired lineman named Carl said she asked about a side path that cut toward Round Bald before the weather turned. He described a calm voice and a careful walker who checked the sky twice and tightened her jacket sleeves. His watch read 4:30 by his account, and his memory stayed fixed on the sound of traffic below. Some locals claimed Carl changed the time later, which state records do not fully address. Dispatch logs mark a second report from a couple who parked beside a dented sedan with faded county stickers. They watched a woman stand near the information board and fold a copy of a trail brochure into a narrow strip. The man recalled her glancing at a silver pickup with an aftermarket light bar, then stepping away without hesitation. The woman recalled a slight limp that appeared only on the downhill portion near the first switchback. Records conflict on whether those statements were taken the same night or days later. Rain moved across Roan High Knob after dark, and patrols split between the paved lot and the forest roads. A ranger from the North Carolina side coordinated with a deputy from the Tennessee side using a shared radio channel. Volunteer searchers gathered near Carver's Gap just after midnight and walked grid lines under steady drizzle and shallow fog. They found boot marks that matched her size near a side trail where moss hid pooled water. Investigators never confirmed those impressions because runoff smeared edges before a cast could cure. Archived notes mention a lightweight day pack found under low branches around a quarter-mile from the main path. Inside were snack wrappers and a folded paper with a grocery list and a museum shift date. A phone sat in the outer pocket with a drained battery and a hair elastic wrapped twice around it. The screen held shallow scratches but no cracks, and the case showed a faded tourist sticker. Technicians pulled the card and recovered brief texts that ended earlier than the last reported sighting. Avery County reports list two unconfirmed leads involving a silver pickup seen idling near the pullout before rain. One hiker said the truck crept past the lot twice, which he found strange given poor visibility and slick pavement. Another hiker said the driver leaned forward and checked the mirror often while the engine surged at irregular intervals. Investigators never confirmed whether the pickup belonged to a local contractor who worked on fences near the highway. Records conflict on the license digits and the description of a sticker behind the rear glass. State records show a previous call involving the same teacher on Roan Mountain during early spring of 2019. She reportedly got turned around in sudden fog near Grassy Ridge and waited beside a cairn until voices approached. The party who found her said she stayed calm and kept talking about frost hollows and bird calls to stay oriented. An incident note described firm boots and a careful pace with brakes at regular intervals despite dropping temperature. Investigators never confirmed whether that episode affected her later planning or gear choices before June. In the week after the disappearance, family and colleagues organized small teams and checked shelters to the north. A museum co-worker carried printouts and asked pieced questions at hostels and gas stations between Elizabethton and Banner Elk. Several people remembered her spending coins on coffee and a pastry at a market near Roan Mountain State Park. Others insisted they saw someone else with similar hair and a similar jacket, which complicated the running timeline. The county file from 2009 contains those notes without a firm ruling on identity. A storm knocked power lines across the ridge and slowed organized searching while crews worked along the highway shoulders. Helicopter support reportedly stood by until wind readings dropped into a safer band above the open balds. Heat signatures came and went as fog shifted across gullies and pooled in low draws between thick spruce. Teams marked possible tracks that crossed and recrossed animal prints near a wet seep where runoff gathered. Investigators never confirmed a single continuous line that matched her boots from the parking area. Weeks later, a trail runner found a stainless bottle wedged under a root beside a shallow step. Blue tape clung to the metal, and a fingerprint technician lifted partials that matched previous samples from her apartment. The cap showed light grit and a torn gasket, which might explain a sweet smell noted by two searchers. Some locals claim the bottle had not been there during early sweeps, which raised questions about movement after rain. Records conflict on when the site was first photographed and tagged for follow-up. The apartment in Johnson City held careful stacks of notebooks and a shoebox filled with admission stickers. One notebook mentioned a plan to walk the Balds alone to map views for a lesson about settlement routes. Another page listed bus times and an alternate ride from a coworker whose statement later changed on 2 points. The coworker first said she offered a ride to the Gap, then said she offered a pickup from the Gap. Investigators never confirmed either offer, which left timing gaps across the late afternoon window. Bank records show a small withdrawal that morning and no further activity after the day of the hike. A library card saw used 2 days earlier for field guides that matched the notes found near the day pack. A phone account tied to a prepaid plan rolled over minutes on schedule without manual action from family. Technicians found no logins after the last tower handshake near the state line on the ridge. Dispatch logs carry that timestamp and mark it as the final verified ping. A rumor formed around an old farm road that drops toward a creek where anglers leave crushed cans. A property owner told deputies about a woman who waved once near a locked gate before stepping into Laurel. He could not fix the date and changed the season at least twice during follow-up interviews. His dog growled at the brush that evening, and he found cords of stacked wood disturbed along the fence. Investigators never confirmed the account, and state records caution that memory shifted after news coverage. Later that summer, a faded sedan matching the parking lot vehicle was towed from a private lot near Elk Park. A shop owner said the driver left it overnight and never returned to settle a quoted repair. The owner thought the driver was male based on height and a cap pulled low across the brow. The tag returned to a different county, and paperwork took time because of mismatched mailing records. Archive notes say the lead produced no direct link to the missing teacher despite initial excitement. By fall, snow brushed the high grass, and searchers changed tactics to check drainages for winter evidence. Teams followed game trails where leaves bridged small streams and gusts erased prints within minutes. A jacket scrap turned up near a low snag, but color comparisons did not match clothing in photographs. A volunteer insisted the fabric felt similar to a liner she wore during spring trips on the same ridge. Investigators never confirmed the match, and records conflict on whether the sample was cataloged correctly. The museum held a small gathering where colleagues read notes about her lectures on birds and trade routes across the mountains. A student recalled her steady pace during a field trip and a habit of counting steps between viewpoints. Another student remembered a hesitant smile that appeared when someone mentioned weather reports and trail etiquette near fragile plants. Some locals claimed she had hinted at moving away, which her sister denied in interviews with a regional reporter. The county file from 2009 keeps both statements without comment on reliability. Winter closed the high road at intervals, and ice grew along shaded cuts where plows could not hold traction. Crews marked fallen limbs and flagged slick corners, while visitors stayed lower in the valley towns. The case slipped from headlines but stayed in quarterly summaries prepared for both county commissions. Detectives traded notes about similar disappearances along the border where ridges tangle and lines divide jurisdiction. Investigators never confirmed meaningful overlap beyond weather patterns and occasional vehicle descriptions. In spring, a new ranger reviewed the folder and walked the first 3 miles north at dawn. He carried the printed dispatch logs and paused where the bale wire fence dips near a wet meadow. He noted how sound traveled along the bald and how voices blended with trucks grinding up the grade. A sudden shift in cloud shadow hid the post where the trail turns, and the path narrowed near wind-stunted trees. His memo suggested a simple misturn compounded by weather and fatigue without clear evidence of intent. Years have not settled the case, and no court file closes the matter with certainty. Reportedly, a hiker sometimes meets a man who still repeats the time and the steps and the exact wind. He stands by the wooden post and points where the grass folds over and the path looks wider than it is. Some locals claim she walked out on a different day and left by a service road near the towers. Investigators never confirmed that ending, and records conflict enough to keep the question alive near Carver's Gap.